A grand marble hall filled with mirrors, chandeliers, and quiet ambition stood in the center of the city, a place where success was not spoken about openly, but measured silently in posture, in eye contact, in hesitation, in the subtle distance people placed between themselves and those they quietly envied. And on that evening the hall was alive with movement, glasses raised, polished shoes crossing marble floors, whispered conversations hidden behind practiced smiles. And yet beneath all of it, something heavier moved unnoticed, something older than success itself, something far more human. Because achievement rarely creates enemies, exposure does. And that evening no one understood that yet, not fully, not consciously, but something close to it had already begun to move through the room. Because among the crowd stood Friedrich Nietzsche, calm, observant, untouched by the rhythm of performance around him, as if he were not attending the gathering at all, but studying it. And that difference did not go unnoticed, because people become aware of stillness most clearly when they themselves are performing, and one of the younger men nearby, dressed sharply, carrying the confidence of someone recently praised by many and secretly, doubted by even more, looked toward Nietzsche and asked a question that sounded casual, but carried something far heavier beneath it, asking why success often feels lonely the higher a person climbs, why admiration sometimes turns into distance, and why the same people who once encouraged you begin to grow quiet the moment you begin to rise. And the question moved through the marble hall like cold air through open doors, because everyone who heard it recognized something personal within it, and envy, unlike ambition, rarely announces itself openly, and Nietzsche did not answer immediately. And that silence created something unusual, because in places built on recognition, silence feels heavier than applause, and heavy silence forces attention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost softer than the music echoing through the chandeliers. And he said that people do not hate your success, they hate what your success reveals about their excuses. And the words did not land like motivation. They landed like truth, and truth rarely comforts at first, and the people around him reacted not with agreement, but with confusion, because the statement did not attack ambition. It redefined resentment, and redefining something so personal creates discomfort, and discomfort, when left without explanation, often turns into resistance. And one of the women standing nearby laughed softly, dismissing the idea as philosophical drama, saying that people celebrate success, admire excellence, respect achievement, and that jealousy belongs only to the weak. And the laughter spread, not because it was understood, but because it restored comfort, and comfort is what people reach for when something familiar begins to feel unstable. And Nietzsche did not react, did not defend his statement, and that lack of reaction slowly began to change the rhythm of the hall. Because when a person refuses to defend what they know, others begin to question what they know, and the laughter became thinner, less certain, and the hall, once filled with admiration, no longer felt entirely safe. The music did not stop, and yet somehow every note began to feel more distant. The soft movement of violins, the quiet clinking of crystal glasses, the polished footsteps crossing marble floors, all of it still existed, and yet none of it felt as immediate as before. Because once a thought begins to turn inward, the world outside often becomes quieter, not because it changes, but because attention moves somewhere deeper, somewhere less comfortable, and the people standing beneath the chandeliers felt that shift, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the confidence they had brought with them. And when confidence begins to weaken, awareness begins to grow. And awareness is rarely gentle, because awareness does not remove envy. It removes the stories people use to hide it. And the guests surrounding him felt that pressure begin to build, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now the question was no longer about success. It was about why success in others could feel so personal in the first place. And personal questions are always harder to escape than philosophical ones. And the young man who had spoken earlier lowered his glass for the first time that evening, his smile fading, his posture no longer as effortless as before, and after several silent moments, he looked toward Friedrich Nietzsche again, this time without performance, without impatience, and asked why the people closest to you often become the most distant the moment you begin to change. And the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but vulnerability. And vulnerability is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something real has finally been touched. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that most people celebrate your potential until your potential begins to become real. And the words moved to the hall differently this time because they did not explain resentment. They exposed it. And exposure is far more difficult to resist than contradiction, because contradiction creates defense, but exposure creates reflection, and reflection is slower, heavier, and far more difficult to escape. And Nietzsche continued, saying that people are comfortable with dreams, with ideas, with ambitions spoken safely in the future, because future success threatens no one, but visible progress changes everything. Because progress creates comparison, and comparison creates discomfort, and discomfort, when left unexplored, often becomes resentment disguised as advice, concern, humor, distance, silence, or subtle disapproval. And the words settled into the guests with quiet weight, because they did not describe jealousy as aggression. They described it as protection. And protection is something people rarely recognize within themselves, because what feels like concern often hides fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of becoming irrelevant, fear confronting what another person's discipline quietly reveals about one's own avoidance. And the people around him felt that idea begin to move through them, not as agreement, but as tension, because now envy was no longer something obvious, no longer something spoken aloud. It becomes something quieter, something more human, something that reached beyond the marble hall itself. And one of the older men standing near the mirror slowly lowered his eyes, his expression harder to read than before, and asked whether success always creates loneliness. And the question hung beneath the chandeliers longer than expected, because everyone standing nearby recognized something personal within it. And Nietzsche looked at him, not with sympathy, not with cruelty, but with clarity, and said that success does not create loneliness. It reveals who was only comfortable with the version of you that needed them. And the words moved deeper than anything before them, because they removed the comforting illusion that support is always unconditional, that friendship automatically survives growth, that admiration automatically survives transformation, and instead they place responsibility where most people least want it, within themselves. And the guests fell quiet, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche, seeing that shift, did not push harder, did not raise his voice, because the hall had already done enough, and instead, he said that the strongest people are not those who rise quickly, but those who continue rising after they realize how many smiles were only temporary. And the words settled into the marble hall with quiet finality, because they did not promise applause, they demanded independence. Because what they were feeling was not jealousy. It was something far more unsettling. A quiet realization that some people never wanted to see you fail. They only wanted you to stay where they could still recognize themselves in you. And for the first time, success no longer felt like victory. It felt like separation. The music did not stop. The glasses were still raised. The laughter still echoed beneath crystal chandeliers and polished marble ceilings. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same. Because something had shifted, not in the hall, not in the conversations, not in the carefully practiced smiles moving from one face to another, but in the way those smiles were now being understood. And that difference was enough to change everything. Because once a person begins to understand success differently, success itself no longer holds the same meaning, and the guests standing beneath the golden light felt it, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they understood ambition, admiration, loyalty, and the quiet distance that often appears the moment someone begins to become more than who they used to be. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it creates enemies, but because it reveals them. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood calmly within that silence, not as someone untouched by rejection, but as someone who had stopped asking rejection to be fair. And that difference was impossible not to notice, because fairness comforts people, but clarity transforms them. And the young man who had spoken first looked toward him again, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance, asking what happens to those who lose friends, admiration, belonging, and even love while trying to become who they were meant to be. And the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but honesty, and honesty is always heavier than certainty, because it appears when performance finally ends. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that losing people is painful, but losing yourself to keep them is fatal. And the words moved through the marble hall with kind of quiet force, because they did not glorify ambition. They stripped it of performance. And performance is what most people hide behind when growth becomes too personal. And Nietzsche continued, saying that many people claim they want to see greatness, but what they often mean is that they want greatness, as long as it does not force them to confront their own excuses. And the guests felt that idea settle into them with quiet weight, because now success was no longer something to achieve, no longer something to display, no longer something to be admired. It had become something to protect. And protection is far heavier than recognition, because recognition only asks you to be seen, but protection asks you to remain yourself even when being yourself becomes expensive. And that is what most people fear more than failure itself. And the hall fell silent, not because anyone agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche walked slowly toward the largest mirror in the hall, the reflection of chandeliers burning quietly above him. And without turning back, he spoke one final time, saying that the price of becoming extraordinary is that ordinary approval can no longer be your source of identity. And the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not promise applause, they demanded separation, and separation is always heavier than achievement, because achievement changes your life, but separation changes who is allowed to walk beside you. And no one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to laugh at, nothing left to hide behind. And as Friedrich Nietzsche disappeared slowly into the reflections of endless mirrors and golden light, the guests remained exactly where they were, and yet none of them felt the same, because once a person realizes that success was never meant to make everyone love them, only to reveal who they become when approval is no longer guaranteed, they cannot fully return to the comfort of who they used to be. The music did not stop. The glasses were still raised. The laughter still echoed beneath crystal chandeliers and polished marble ceilings. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same.